The room was silent except for the faint creak of the old wooden floorboards beneath her feet. She could feel the weight of the air pressing down, thick with dust and the lingering scent of old wood. The sunlight filtered through the grimy window, casting slanted beams across the room, but even the light seemed unable to penetrate the oppressive stillness. She had woken here again, as she had countless times before, unable to move beyond the threshold of the doorway that led to freedom. The door stood unlocked, the latch untouched, yet her body refused to obey. It was as if the room itself had claimed her, an invisible force holding her in place, and the knowledge that she was trapped gnawed at the edges of her mind. Every detail was sharp, painfully so, the faded wallpaper peeling at the corners, the slight mustiness in the air, the faint echo of distant sounds that might have been real or imagined. Her heart pounded as she looked around the room, each object familiar yet somehow distorted in her perception. The wardrobe in the corner leaned slightly, as if it had grown tired of standing upright. The bedspread was a muted shade, threadbare from years of use, but the pattern seemed to writhe subtly when she stared too long. She reached out to touch the fabric, but her fingers hovered just above it, reluctant to make contact. It was not fear of the material itself, but a deep, unplaceable dread of what might happen if she fully engaged with her surroundings. The room had a rhythm of its own, a slow, pulsing insistence that she remain within its walls. Time felt fractured here. She could swear she had been asleep for minutes, hours, or perhaps days, yet when she glanced at the clock, its hands had not moved. She remembered the dreams that brought her here. At first, they were vivid and strange, images bleeding into one another in impossible ways, a corridor stretching endlessly, the sound of whispers behind locked doors, shadows that moved of their own volition. In these dreams, she tried to leave, reaching for the doorway, only to find herself back where she started. The transition from dream to waking life offered no relief, even when her eyes opened, she remained trapped. The line between sleep and consciousness had dissolved, leaving her suspended in a perpetual state of uneasy awareness. Her thoughts spiraled, questioning her own senses. Was she losing her mind, or was the room itself bending reality to its will? The family around her had begun to speak in hushed tones about these phenomena, but their words felt hollow, insufficient to explain the magnitude of what was occurring. She could hear snippets of their conversations, fragments of disbelief mixed with fear. "It's just a nightmare," someone would say, and yet their own expressions betrayed the certainty that the room was more than a simple dream. It was as if each family member had become both witness and participant in a ritual they could not comprehend, bound together by an invisible chain that no rational explanation could sever. The tension within the household had grown, subtle at first, then undeniable. Meals were taken in silence, eyes avoiding the door that led nowhere, and footsteps were measured, cautious, as if any sudden movement might awaken the room's attention. She tried to focus on tangible details to anchor herself. The texture of the rug beneath her feet, the weight of the heavy curtains when she pulled them aside, the faint glint of metal from a tarnished doorknob, all these things were real, yet the room warped her perception of them. Even the familiar became strange and threatening under its influence. Sounds that should have been ordinary, the wind outside, a bird landing on the windowsill, seemed amplified, echoing in the corners of her consciousness, feeding into a growing paranoia. The room demanded attention, absorbed it, and left her unable to divert her mind elsewhere. Every thought she tried to form was tinged with unease, as though the walls themselves had a way of reading her intentions and twisting them into anxiety. Hours, or perhaps minutes, passed in this suspended reality. She moved cautiously around the space, testing the boundaries that should have been obvious but were now fluid and shifting. A chair appeared closer than she remembered, a shadow stretched longer than the angle of the sun could justify. The room seemed to breathe with her, expanding and contracting in a rhythm that mirrored her own heartbeat. She longed to scream, to demand release, but her voice felt swallowed by the heavy air. Even internally, her thoughts struggled to maintain coherence, slipping into loops of fear and resignation. The isolation was total. No one could reach her here, the world outside existed only as a distant hum beyond the walls. She recalled the pattern. Every family member had experienced similar entrapments, always in this very room, always under circumstances that defied explanation. She thought of her brother, who had once vanished for hours only to return pale and unresponsive, muttering about doors that led nowhere. Her mother had spoken of dreams that bled into reality, of waking to find herself staring at a locked window with no memory of climbing the stairs. The cumulative weight of these stories pressed down upon her, reinforcing the certainty that this room was more than an ordinary place. It was a nexus, a living entity that fed on attention and fear, growing stronger with every trapped occupant. In the corners of her vision, she began to notice subtle movements. A curtain twitched though no breeze entered, a shadow shifted though no light had changed. Her pulse quickened, and the room seemed to respond, pulsing in tandem with her rising anxiety. It was impossible to determine where her fear ended and the room's influence began. Each attempt to rationalize or flee only deepened the sense of confinement. Even the act of looking around became a torment, as though the room was aware of her scrutiny and enjoyed the tension it provoked. Time, space, and logic had lost meaning. Despite the despair, a flicker of determination emerged. She tested the door again, gripping the knob firmly, willing her body to move forward. Her feet lifted, her hands pressed against the wood, but the resistance persisted. The room was patient, unyielding, an unspoken entity that refused to acknowledge her autonomy. She sank to the floor, feeling the cold press against her skin, and allowed herself to breathe, attempting to reconcile the impossibility of escape with the need to survive. In that quiet surrender, she perceived the subtle patterns of the room, the way light shifted, the rhythm of shadows, the faint hum that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Perhaps understanding its cadence was the first step toward liberation, though liberation remained tantalizingly out of reach. The afternoon waned, and the room's grip remained unbroken. She watched as the light dimmed, shadows lengthened, and the silence grew more profound. The room was both trap and teacher, enforcing stillness while revealing the fragility of perception. She felt the weight of history pressing down upon her, the countless others in her family who had been ensnared, the legacy of whispered warnings, the invisible scars left by failed attempts to flee. And yet, beneath the dread, a strange fascination took hold. The room was an enigma, a puzzle impossible to solve yet impossible to ignore. It demanded attention, demanded presence, and in that relentless insistence, it became impossible to look away. The estate sat at the edge of a small, fog-shrouded village, its silhouette barely distinguishable against the backdrop of dense, dark woods. Built in the late 19th century, the house had seen generations of the family pass through its halls, each leaving subtle marks that whispered of lives both ordinary and tragic. The architecture was a mixture of austere stonework and delicate, faded ornamentation, tall windows with chipped sills, heavy wooden doors scarred by decades of use, and a roofline that seemed to sag under the weight of history. From the outside, it appeared stately, though the air around it carried an almost palpable heaviness, as if the house itself exhaled centuries of memories and secrets. Villagers often remarked that the estate seemed to brood, its shadows stretching long before sunset and lingering long after darkness fell. The family's lineage was one woven with both prestige and whispered misfortune. Records traced back several generations, detailing lives punctuated by early deaths, bouts of mental instability, and a strict adherence to religious observances. Each generation carried an invisible burden, a mix of inherited fragility and isolation from the community. The patriarchs were stern and methodical, maintaining an outward appearance of propriety while hiding the fraying threads of their domestic lives. The matriarchs were equally imposing, managing households with rigid discipline and a watchful eye, yet often retreating into private sorrow or secretive rituals. Children born into this environment were raised in a delicate balance of expectation and fear, learning to navigate both affection and strict correction, and observing the unspoken rules that governed family behavior. Life in the village itself was quiet and insular, a world where everyone knew each other's histories and reputations. The townspeople often speculated about the family, offering fragments of gossip about strange habits or unusual occurrences. Some spoke of the children wandering the estate's corridors late at night, their eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and dread. Others whispered of servants who had left abruptly, claiming they could no longer endure the weight of unspoken tensions. The family's reputation was thus a mix of respect and unease, admired for their standing yet approached with caution by those who valued self-preservation. This duality, prestige paired with suspicion, set the stage for the extraordinary events that would come to define the family's narrative. Inside the estate, the atmosphere was heavy with the scent of aged wood, musty fabrics, and a faint, underlying trace of smoke from the fireplaces that had been burning for decades. Rooms were decorated with a careful eye toward tradition, heavy curtains, ornate furniture carved with delicate patterns, and portraits of stern ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow visitors with quiet judgment. Yet beneath this veneer of respectability, there were hints of decay and neglect. Wallpaper peeled at the corners, carpets bore the stains of years, and the wooden floors creaked in protest under the lightest step. Every element of the house seemed to carry both the weight of history and the faint suggestion of something unnameable lurking just out of sight. The juxtaposition of order and subtle chaos mirrored the family itself, outwardly composed, yet internally fraying under pressures that defied explanation. The family's history with mental health issues added another layer to the estate's atmosphere. Documentation from local doctors and private journals indicated a pattern of anxiety, insomnia, and intense, sometimes delusional dreams across multiple generations. The adults often attempted to manage these tendencies through strict routines, rigid discipline, and religious observances, yet the patterns persisted, suggesting a deeper, perhaps hereditary, predisposition. Children were frequently observed exhibiting unusual behaviors, talking to unseen figures, wandering in trance-like states, or reacting with disproportionate fear to ordinary events. While some incidents were dismissed as childhood imagination, the frequency and consistency of these episodes could not be ignored. The house, the family, and the minds within it seemed caught in a web that combined biology, psychology, and the subtle influence of their environment. Folklore surrounding the estate further complicated the family's history. Local legends spoke of rooms that held spirits, mirrors that reflected events from the past, and doors that led to nowhere. While many villagers considered these tales mere superstition, the family's own experiences seemed to echo the stories in uncanny ways. Servants and visitors occasionally reported strange sensations, cold drafts that could not be explained, whispers without a source, and the unsettling feeling of being watched. The estate itself, though firmly grounded in reality, acquired an almost mythical dimension, a place where ordinary life and the extraordinary coexisted uneasily. The family's daily routines were shaped by these histories and the weight of their environment. Meals were taken in formal silence, with careful attention to propriety and avoidance of sensitive topics. Education for the children was rigorous, often conducted at home, emphasizing discipline, memory, and religious instruction. Social interactions were limited, both by choice and by the community's cautious regard. Outsiders were rarely invited, and when they were met with meticulous courtesy, masking an underlying tension that was immediately perceptible. Within the walls of the estate, conversations were measured, gestures deliberate, and every action seemed part of an unspoken code designed to maintain stability amid underlying fragility. As the family's history unfolded, subtle patterns emerged. Reports of intense dreams, temporary disorientation, and inexplicable behaviors were scattered across decades, suggesting that the room which would later become infamous had exerted influence long before it was recognized. The estate, in all its grandeur and decay, functioned as both home and crucible, shaping the lives and minds of its inhabitants in ways that were at once tangible and ineffable. Each generation inherited not just the physical space, but the weight of past experiences, fears, and unexplained phenomena. The stage was thus perfectly set, a family steeped in tradition, bound by both love and fear, and a house that seemed almost sentient in its capacity to shape their reality. The first subtle disturbances began almost imperceptibly, like the quiet ripple of water across a still pond. At first, they seemed trivial, easily dismissible, a misplaced object, a faint whisper in the hallway, the sensation of being observed when no one else was present. Yet over time, these minor anomalies grew more frequent, more insistent, until the family could no longer ignore them. The children were the first to notice, reporting fleeting shadows that crossed their vision or hearing voices that called their names from empty rooms. Their descriptions were vivid and precise, unsettling in their consistency. Parents initially attributed these experiences to imagination or childish fancy, yet the sheer regularity of the accounts suggested that something deeper, more inexplicable was at play. Objects within the estate began to shift in ways that defied logic. Chairs appeared slightly out of place, windows that had been tightly latched were found open, and personal items moved without explanation. When family members attempted to mark their possessions or lock doors, the results were inconsistent. Some items remained untouched, others shifted as if obeying an unseen hand. This subtle defiance of physical laws, combined with the family's growing anxiety, created an environment in which no action felt secure or certain. Even the act of walking through familiar corridors became disorienting, as spaces seemed to subtly warp or stretch in ways that could not be measured. Dreams became increasingly vivid, spilling into waking moments with a disconcerting clarity. Family members recounted experiences in which the boundaries between sleep and consciousness blurred, waking in one room while being sure they had fallen asleep in another, hearing conversations in dreams that continued in reality, or sensing physical sensations that persisted beyond the dream state. These experiences were accompanied by a growing sense of helplessness. Attempts to control or interrupt them only intensified the sensations of entrapment. A subtle terror began to take root, one not of immediate danger but of the persistent, creeping loss of autonomy. Psychological strain grew as the anomalies multiplied. The family found themselves second-guessing their own perceptions, questioning whether they were losing their minds or if the house itself was acting with intent. Tension within the household increased, with arguments breaking out over what should have been ordinary matters, each disagreement colored by underlying fear. Parents struggled to maintain authority, unsure whether the children's reports were imaginative exaggerations or accurate accounts of events beyond comprehension. The atmosphere became one of constant unease, as if the walls themselves monitored thought and behavior, subtly influencing emotions and interactions. Servants and occasional visitors began reporting their own experiences, adding weight to the anomalies. Some described hearing faint footsteps when the estate was empty, or catching glimpses of figures at the edges of their vision. Others recounted doors that closed by themselves or lights that flickered without explanation. While these occurrences were often dismissed by the family as misunderstandings or tricks of perception, the growing frequency and consistency of reports suggested a pattern that could no longer be ignored. The estate itself appeared to act as a focal point for these disturbances, concentrating attention and feeding subtle unease into those who entered. A sense of rhythm developed in the anomalies, though it was irregular and unpredictable. Shadows would lengthen unnaturally in one moment, then recede to normal proportions the next. Sounds, footsteps, whispers, or faint knocks, would occur in intervals that seemed to defy natural explanation. The family, desperate to maintain normalcy, attempted to create routines and impose structure, but these efforts were often undermined by inexplicable disruptions. Even the smallest events, a candle flickering, a clock chiming off schedule, were imbued with heightened significance, eroding the sense of security that had previously defined the household. Children's behavior reflected the growing psychological impact of these disturbances. Some became withdrawn, speaking little and avoiding interaction, while others displayed heightened alertness, scanning the rooms for unseen threats. Sleep became increasingly elusive, with nightmares intruding more frequently and intensely. Attempts to comfort the children were complicated by the parents' own anxiety, creating a feedback loop of fear and uncertainty. Every night brought the possibility of being drawn into the room's mysterious influence, further destabilizing the family's sense of safety and cohesion. The family began keeping informal records of unusual events, noting time, location, and description in journals scattered throughout the estate. These notes revealed patterns that were both fascinating and horrifying. The same corridor experienced disturbances at similar times, certain rooms seemed to amplify disorientation, and objects tended to move toward specific locations in ways that could not be explained. The act of recording events provided a semblance of control, yet it also reinforced the reality that these occurrences were not isolated incidents, they were persistent, systematic, and growing in complexity. An undercurrent of dread began to pervade daily life. Meals were taken in tense silence, conversations were cautious, and each family member moved with deliberate care, as though missteps might provoke the room itself. Ordinary tasks, cleaning, reading, walking through hallways, were performed with heightened awareness, every sound and movement scrutinized for anomalies. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, a sense that at any moment the familiar world could shift, leaving them trapped in some new and unexplainable scenario. The ordinary became fraught with significance, and every gesture carried the weight of potential consequence. Despite attempts at rationalization, a creeping acknowledgement emerged: the disturbances were not mere coincidences or figments of imagination. Something within the estate, something centered in the room that would later become infamous, was asserting influence over perception, behavior, and even dreams. This recognition was subtle at first, a quiet, unsettling thought, but it grew into a persistent awareness that colored every action. The family began to realize that they were not merely experiencing strange events, they were participants in a phenomenon that defied reason, one that demanded attention, scrutiny, and ultimately, a confrontation with the unknown. Stories of the family's strange experiences began to spread beyond the walls of the estate, carried first in hushed whispers by servants, then by neighbors and local villagers who had glimpsed or heard odd occurrences. Witnesses described events that were at once subtle and disturbing: faint cries echoing through locked rooms, lights flickering at odd hours, and figures moving in ways that defied natural explanation. Each account added another layer to the growing tapestry of unease surrounding the household. While skeptics dismissed many reports as exaggeration or imagination, the sheer consistency and repetition of experiences suggested that something unusual, perhaps inexplicable, was unfolding. Neighbors reported seeing children wandering the estate at odd hours, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination, speaking in hushed tones to invisible presences. Servants who had worked for the family recounted peculiar phenomena: doors closing on their own, footsteps echoing in empty corridors, and objects shifting positions without human intervention. Some had experienced brief disorientation, losing track of time or place within rooms that should have been familiar. These accounts, though anecdotal, created a cumulative impression that the estate was a locus of inexplicable activity, a place where ordinary rules of perception and reality did not fully apply. As more witnesses came forward, the tension between belief and disbelief intensified. Some townspeople sought rational explanations: drafts, faulty construction, or overactive imaginations, but these hypotheses often failed to account for the sheer number and consistency of reports. Others framed the events in terms of folklore, suggesting that spirits, curses, or ancestral debts might explain the family's experiences. The interplay between reason and superstition amplified the sense of uncertainty, leaving both the family and the community unsettled. Each new story, whether whispered at the market or recounted by a traveling visitor, reinforced the sense that the estate was far from ordinary, and that its influence extended beyond the family's private walls. The family's own observations added weight to the accounts. They noted how disturbances tended to follow patterns: lights flickering at specific times, sounds emerging in consistent sequences, and the feeling of being watched recurring across generations. Family members attempted to dismiss these occurrences, attributing them to fatigue or imagination, but the repetition made denial increasingly difficult. Even moments of respite were brief. Ordinary experiences were tinged with the anticipation that the next anomaly might strike at any moment. This persistent unpredictability heightened anxiety and created an environment in which no one felt entirely safe, even within the confines of their own home. Interactions with outsiders were fraught with tension. Visitors often left the estate shaken, reporting sensations of unease, sudden chills, or fleeting glimpses of movement that could not be logically explained. Religious figures were called in, attempting blessings and protective rituals, yet even these interventions did not fully alleviate the disturbances. Medical practitioners observed the family and documented their behavior, noting signs of stress, insomnia, and anxiety that appeared disproportionate to ordinary circumstances. Despite professional assessments, no clear explanation emerged, leaving both the family and the community in a liminal space between rationality and the uncanny. As the whispers grew louder, the community's perception of the family shifted. Respect mingled with fear, admiration with suspicion. The estate became a source of quiet fascination, a subject of speculation that spanned generations. Children in the village were warned to avoid the property after dark, and casual visitors often hesitated at the gates, sensing an unspoken tension that emanated from the house itself. Tales of shadows, cries, and inexplicable movements were shared in the marketplace, over fences, and in church pews, blending fact and rumor until the line between observation and legend was indistinct. Despite growing external attention, the family attempted to maintain appearances. They continued routines, hosted occasional visitors, and preserved the outward semblance of propriety. Yet even within these carefully orchestrated interactions, anomalies persisted. Conversations would falter, objects would shift subtly, and fleeting shadows would cross rooms at moments that seemed intentionally timed. The duality of their lives, presenting normalcy to the outside world while privately grappling with persistent disturbances, added layers of psychological strain, reinforcing the perception that the estate was a place where ordinary experience was continually undermined by unseen forces. The emotional impact of these observations was profound. Family members reported feelings of paranoia, helplessness, and a creeping dread that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The awareness that others had witnessed aspects of the disturbances lent legitimacy to their fears, while simultaneously amplifying the pressure to explain or contain them. The accumulation of external accounts served as both validation and intensifier, confirming that the phenomena were real while deepening the sense of inescapable scrutiny. Through witness accounts, a pattern of interaction between the estate and those who entered it became discernible. Visitors' reactions, ranging from subtle unease to overt fear, mirrored the family's own experiences, suggesting that the property exerted an influence that transcended individual psychology. Shadows, sounds, and inexplicable movements were experienced consistently across different observers, hinting at a force or presence that was persistent and systematic. The narrative of the estate, once confined to the family, was now shared, creating a communal layer of mystery that blurred the lines between personal torment and public phenomenon. By the end of this phase, the estate had transformed in collective consciousness from a private family home into a locus of enduring mystery. Each new testimony, each whispered observation, reinforced the perception that something beyond ordinary comprehension was at work. The family's isolation, the subtle manipulations of space and perception, and the increasing engagement of the wider community created a complex interplay of fear, fascination, and disbelief. The atmosphere was dense with anticipation and uncertainty, laying the groundwork for the escalating events that would continue to unravel the fabric of both family life and the local community. Efforts to rationalize the strange events within the estate often led the family to turn to faith and spiritual guidance, though these interventions proved unsettlingly insufficient. Clergy were summoned from the village and beyond, bringing with them rituals, prayers, and blessings meant to protect and purify the household. Candles were lit, holy water sprinkled across doorways, and sacred texts recited with solemnity, yet the anomalies persisted. Windows that had been securely latched swung open at odd hours, shadows shifted in ways that defied the angles of light, and whispers continued to thread through empty halls. Each failed attempt at spiritual intervention deepened the family's anxiety and blurred the boundary between the sacred and the inexplicable. Religious beliefs were deeply ingrained in the family's identity, and the persistence of these disturbances challenged not only their sense of security but their understanding of moral and spiritual order. The patriarch and matriarch, accustomed to viewing hardship and misfortune as tests of faith or divine judgment, struggled to reconcile the inexplicable occurrences with their belief systems. Every failure of a blessing or rite to produce tangible results created cognitive dissonance, forcing them to confront the possibility that the estate's disturbances were not acts of divine intent, nor simple misfortune, but something entirely beyond human comprehension. The tension between faith and reality became a constant presence, influencing every decision and shaping interactions within the household. Attempts to explain the phenomena within a spiritual framework often exacerbated fear rather than alleviating it. Religious advisors suggested that the family might be under a curse or experiencing the consequences of ancestral sins, interpretations that resonated with older legends whispered in the village. These explanations offered a semblance of understanding but also imposed moral weight and guilt upon the family, further complicating their already fragile psychological state. Children were cautioned about behaviors that could invite spirits or provoke the unseen, turning ordinary activities into exercises of vigilance and caution. The estate itself became a stage on which morality, superstition, and inexplicable phenomena intersected, creating a persistent, tense atmosphere that suffused daily life. The failure of spiritual measures forced the family to oscillate between hope and despair. For a moment, a blessing might seem to ease the intensity of disturbances, shadows might retreat, or the sensation of being watched might lessen. Yet these reprieves were temporary, offering only brief solace before the anomalies returned with renewed intensity. Each cycle of attempted intervention and subsequent failure reinforced a creeping sense of helplessness. The family found themselves increasingly aware of the estate's power to resist control, whether spiritual, psychological, or physical. The room that would later define the family's torment remained central, a locus where both faith and reason proved insufficient. This period also brought the subtle intrusion of isolation. Villagers, initially curious, began to hesitate in offering assistance, wary of the estate's growing reputation as a place of unease. Visitors were often unnerved, retreating quickly from interactions with the family, leaving the household to confront disturbances in solitude. Even clergy and advisors, after repeated failures, expressed hesitation, acknowledging with quiet concern that the estate's influence was persistent and enigmatic. This retreat reinforced the sense of vulnerability within the family, emphasizing that outside intervention, once relied upon as a safeguard, was not an assured remedy. The psychological toll of these failed attempts was profound. Adults struggled to maintain authority and composure in the face of inexplicable occurrences, while children increasingly internalized fear and uncertainty. Anxiety and paranoia became woven into daily life. Family members walked lightly through halls, careful not to disturb objects that might shift of their own accord, and avoided areas where disturbances were most pronounced. The line between rational precaution and obsessive vigilance blurred, creating an environment in which every action carried potential consequence, and the invisible weight of the room's influence grew ever heavier. The tension between disbelief and belief deepened as religious explanations failed to account for the entirety of experiences. Attempts at moral reasoning or spiritual understanding provided only partial frameworks, leaving gaps filled by uncertainty and dread. Family members began documenting events meticulously, noting anomalies and occurrences in journals, as though careful observation might reveal patterns invisible to casual perception. This documentation, while pragmatic, also served as a testament to the limits of faith in the face of unrelenting strangeness. The written record became both a tool for understanding and a mirror reflecting the family's increasing desperation. Interpersonal dynamics were strained under these pressures. Disagreements about the interpretation of events, methods of response, and appropriate levels of vigilance created tension among adults. Children mirrored these conflicts, sometimes resisting guidance, other times internalizing the fear projected by their elders. The family's cohesion, previously anchored by routine and shared belief, was destabilized. Ordinary interactions, meals, conversations, bedtime routines, became exercises in maintaining composure while negotiating the constant, unpredictable influence of the estate. Every gesture and word carried potential significance, magnifying the emotional weight of daily life. Despite the failures of spiritual intervention, moments of tentative hope emerged. On rare occasions, blessings or prayers appeared to coincide with brief calm, offering fleeting reassurance that some measure of protection was possible. Yet these instances were ephemeral and inconsistent, underscoring the estate's resistance to sustained control. The intermittent nature of relief reinforced a sense of vigilance and dependency, compelling the family to remain constantly alert, always testing, always seeking understanding. In this delicate balance, faith remained a source of comfort and frustration, intertwined with the family's growing realization that conventional methods of explanation were insufficient. By the conclusion of this period, the family had come to recognize that the estate, and particularly the room at its center, could not be contained by ritual, prayer, or moral supposition alone. Religious and moral frameworks, while providing context and structure, were ultimately inadequate in addressing the persistent, inexplicable anomalies. The tension between hope and despair, faith and doubt, became a defining characteristic of the household. The room's influence, resisting all attempts at containment or explanation, continued to assert itself, laying the groundwork for the deeper psychological challenges and escalating disturbances that would follow. The weight of the estate's influence began to press more insistently on the family, manifesting not only in subtle anomalies but in the unraveling of their mental and emotional stability. Days blurred into nights, and nights into fragmented cycles of wakefulness and dream, leaving each member trapped in a perpetual state of fatigue and heightened anxiety. Dreams intensified, often indistinguishable from waking reality, and the lines separating perception from hallucination eroded entirely. Shadows in the corners of rooms seemed to lengthen and shift with intent, while fleeting whispers, half-heard and impossible to locate, punctuated the oppressive silence. The room that had initially drawn attention as a locus of subtle disturbances now asserted itself as a force of psychological domination, exerting power over thought, memory, and perception. Each family member experienced the encroaching influence in distinct yet interrelated ways. The adults, who had long clung to rational explanations or spiritual frameworks, found themselves increasingly disoriented. Concentration became a struggle, simple tasks were fraught with uncertainty, and emotions oscillated unpredictably between anger, despair, and fleeting hope. The children, already attuned to the anomalies, began exhibiting more pronounced behavioral changes. Some retreated into prolonged silence, refusing interaction, others displayed sudden bursts of anxiety or agitation, their eyes darting to corners where nothing seemed to exist. Attempts to comfort or intervene often exacerbated the distress, as every reassurance was shadowed by the persistent reminder of the room's unyielding control. Paranoia became a shared experience. Each member of the family grew wary not only of the estate itself but of one another, as the room seemed to amplify small misunderstandings into moments of intense suspicion. An argument over a misplaced object could escalate into hours of tense silence, with lingering resentment and fear coloring subsequent interactions. Even mundane activities, preparing meals, tending to the garden, or performing household chores, were undertaken with heightened vigilance, as though any misstep might provoke further anomalies. The psychological toll was cumulative, building a sense of entrapment that extended beyond the physical confines of the house into the very fabric of daily life. Sleep became a battleground. Nightmares intruded with unrelenting frequency, merging with fragmented wakefulness to create experiences that were simultaneously vivid and hallucinatory. Family members recounted sensations of being unable to move, of reaching for doors that would not open, or of being watched from within their own rooms. Physical sensations, pressure on the chest, tingling limbs, inexplicable cold, accompanied these experiences, reinforcing the perception of a tangible force at work. Attempts to soothe one another often failed, as the boundaries between personal perception and the room's influence blurred, leaving both adults and children unable to differentiate real threat from imagined terror. The estate itself appeared complicit in the psychological unraveling. Walls that had previously seemed static now appeared to breathe and warp subtly, doors resisted touch, and familiar furniture seemed to alter its position when unobserved. Even light behaved inconsistently. Shadows flickered without source, sunlight through windows elongated unnaturally, and lamps dimmed inexplicably. These distortions intensified the family's sense of disorientation, as the environment itself became an active agent in their decline. The combination of sensory distortion and relentless anxiety created a pervasive feeling of entrapment, as if the very architecture conspired to weaken resolve and fracture perception. Attempts to maintain routine and normalcy were undermined by the growing instability. Mealtimes became tense affairs, with conversations stilted and eyes avoiding one another in unspoken fear. Simple tasks required excessive concentration, and the fear of triggering another anomaly made even minor decisions fraught with uncertainty. Adults vacillated between attempting reassurance and succumbing to their own panic, while children internalized these tensions, absorbing the pervasive dread that infused every corner of the estate. The household existed in a fragile equilibrium, balanced between effortful control and creeping chaos, each day eroding the thin veneer of stability. Isolation compounded the psychological strain. Villagers, already wary of the estate, hesitated to engage with the family, leaving them to confront the room's influence largely alone. Clergy and advisors, after repeated failures, expressed uncertainty and retreated, reinforcing the sense that no external intervention could provide relief. The family's internal support system strained under the weight of persistent anomalies, as each member struggled to navigate their own perceptions while attempting to sustain cohesion. The absence of reliable external guidance magnified the sense of vulnerability, making the estate not merely a home but a psychological labyrinth from which there seemed no exit. The family's journal-keeping intensified during this period, as documentation became both a coping mechanism and a method of attempting to understand the room's patterns. Notes detailed times of occurrences, descriptions of anomalies, and personal emotional responses. Yet even this methodical approach provided only partial clarity, as events frequently defied chronology, logic, and expectation. The act of recording became a double-edged sword. It offered structure and focus, but also reinforced the persistent awareness of being under relentless observation by the room. Each entry was a testament to both resilience and the encroaching breakdown of reason. Interpersonal dynamics deteriorated under the weight of constant stress. Arguments, once minor, now escalated rapidly, trust was eroded by persistent fear, and family members often withdrew from one another to preserve their fragile sense of control. Moments of connection were brief and tenuous, overshadowed by the omnipresent awareness of the room's influence. Emotional intimacy was replaced by guarded interaction, as even gestures of care risked triggering distress or amplifying tension. The family's cohesion, once rooted in routine and shared history, frayed under the combined pressure of psychological deterioration and environmental distortion. By the culmination of this escalation, it was evident that the room's influence extended far beyond mere inconvenience or superficial disturbance. It had become an active force shaping thought, perception, and behavior, eroding the family's autonomy and reshaping their psychological reality. The interplay of sleep disruption, sensory distortion, interpersonal tension, and relentless uncertainty created a suffocating atmosphere in which rationality struggled to survive. Each member, in their own way, was caught between attempts to assert control and the inexorable pull of the room, setting the stage for the eventual confrontation with forces that defied both explanation and resistance. As the family's experiences grew more intense and inexplicable, attempts to understand and rationalize the phenomena took on greater urgency. Outside experts, doctors, psychologists, and folklorists, were consulted, each offering interpretations that reflected their own disciplines, biases, and limitations. Psychologists suggested shared delusions or forms of mass hysteria, theorizing that the family's isolation, strict routines, and history of mental instability had produced a collective psychological manifestation. Reports and interviews were gathered meticulously, noting the consistency of accounts, yet these explanations could not fully account for the tangible anomalies, objects shifting inexplicably, doors resisting touch, and shadows moving in defiance of light. The dissonance between clinical theory and observable events created tension both for the family and for those attempting to analyze them, leaving a persistent sense of ambiguity. Medical practitioners examined the family individually, documenting sleep disturbances, anxiety, and signs of psychological stress, yet were repeatedly confounded by events that occurred under observation. During consultations, family members described sensations of paralysis, dreamlike experiences that intruded into waking life, and a pervasive sense of being watched. While doctors could diagnose insomnia, anxiety, and hallucinations, they could not account for the coordinated, repeated patterns of disturbance across multiple individuals and generations. Even the most rigorous scientific methodology seemed insufficient, as anomalies continued to manifest in ways that resisted measurement, predictability, or conventional logic. Folklorists and local historians approached the estate from a different perspective, framing the phenomena in terms of cultural memory and ancestral legacy. They drew upon legends of haunted rooms, spirits bound to place, and curses transmitted through family lines, suggesting that the estate itself might carry an inherited influence capable of shaping perception and behavior. These interpretations were deeply compelling to the family, whose awareness of past generations' experiences lent credibility to the notion that their struggles were part of a longer continuum. Yet folklore alone could not explain the precise, repeatable nature of some occurrences, leaving a gap between myth and observable reality that both fascinated and unnerved those involved. The interplay between scientific and folkloric perspectives intensified the family's internal struggle. Adults attempted to reconcile rational thought with the possibility of supernatural influence, while children absorbed the tension, often mirroring fear and uncertainty in subtle behavioral changes. Efforts to maintain normalcy became exercises in careful negotiation between reason, superstition, and lived experience. The family began to develop strategies to cope, documenting events in journals, testing the persistence of anomalies, and creating routines aimed at minimizing disruption. These strategies offered a sense of agency but were often undermined by the estate's persistent and unpredictable influence. Physical spaces within the estate were examined with increasing scrutiny. Certain rooms, particularly the one that had first manifested the most intense phenomena, were observed for environmental triggers, drafts, temperature changes, and architectural irregularities. Measurements and inspections revealed nothing out of the ordinary, intensifying the sense of mystery. Yet family members continued to report sensations of being constrained, watched, or guided by unseen forces. Attempts to modify or block access to rooms proved ineffective, doors locked or unlocked themselves, shadows appeared in impossible positions, and objects defied relocation. The estate, it seemed, operated according to principles entirely outside the comprehension of visitors, experts, or residents. Case notes and personal diaries became essential tools in the effort to analyze and understand the estate's influence. Psychologists recorded behavioral patterns, documenting anxiety cycles, sleep disturbances, and interpersonal tension. Folklorists catalogued legends, oral histories, and family anecdotes, highlighting recurring motifs and symbols that seemed to transcend generations. Together, these records provided a multi-layered, though incomplete, account of the estate's impact. Cross-referencing anomalies with documented histories revealed correlations that were unsettlingly precise. Disturbances tended to concentrate in certain areas, peak at particular times, and follow sequences that suggested intentionality rather than random chance. The family and observers alike began to recognize that the phenomena were not merely coincidental or purely psychological, but part of a larger, structured pattern that resisted explanation. The growing interplay between belief and skepticism created social and emotional tension. Family members oscillated between faith in science, reliance on spiritual tradition, and a creeping acknowledgement of forces beyond understanding. Disagreements arose over how to approach interventions, which events warranted documentation, and whether continued investigation might provoke further disturbances. These tensions, layered atop pre-existing anxiety and sleep deprivation, intensified the psychological impact of the estate. Even minor disagreements could escalate, as the underlying stress magnified reactions and strained relationships, further destabilizing a household already operating under extreme duress. As the investigation continued, a broader understanding emerged: the estate's influence was neither entirely physical nor entirely psychological. Scientific observations revealed measurable patterns and disruptions, yet folklore and lived experience suggested a persistent, almost sentient presence that engaged with family members in ways that transcended empirical measurement. This duality, rational yet inexplicable, created a tension that defined daily life within the estate. The family found themselves navigating a complex web in which every action, observation, or attempted intervention might provoke, amplify, or fail to influence the persistent anomalies, highlighting the profound limitations of human comprehension when confronted with forces that straddle the boundary between reason and the uncanny. In this period of attempts to explain the unexplainable, the estate became a laboratory of perception, fear, and resilience. Each observer, scientist, folklorist, or family member, interacted with the phenomena in ways shaped by prior belief, personal experience and psychological state. The resulting records and accounts, while meticulous, revealed only partial understanding. The anomalies continued to manifest unpredictably, reinforcing the impression that the room and the estate as a whole operated according to principles entirely beyond human mastery. The tension between explanation and lived experience, between observation and the unknowable, became the defining characteristic of the family's struggle, setting the stage for the subsequent collapse and intensification of the estate's influence over their minds, bodies, and perceptions. The estate's influence reached a crescendo as the family's lives became increasingly dominated by the inexplicable forces within their home. The room that had first manifested subtle anomalies now seemed to assert itself with a relentless intensity, warping perception, disrupting routine, and eroding any sense of safety. Shadows no longer merely flickered at the edges of vision, they moved with intent, stretching unnaturally across floors and walls, sometimes forming shapes vaguely human yet impossible in proportion. Sounds, once occasional whispers or faint creaks, now became persistent, footsteps pacing hallways when no one walked, knocks at locked doors, murmurs that seemed to echo the thoughts of those present. The estate had transformed into a living labyrinth, one in which every corridor, doorway, and shadow appeared complicit in asserting control over the family's minds and bodies. Isolation deepened, both physical and psychological. Villagers avoided the estate with increasing vigilance, leaving the family to confront the room's influence largely alone. Even those once willing to visit, clergy, scholars, and medical observers, retreated under the weight of repeated, unexplainable experiences. The family, cut off from external validation and support, became trapped within a feedback loop of fear and hyper-awareness. Every action, from walking through corridors to preparing meals, was accompanied by heightened vigilance, as though any misstep could trigger the room's next manifestation. Routine became ritualized, not for comfort but as a fragile strategy to navigate an environment that seemed actively hostile. Sleep, once a temporary refuge, became a domain of terror. Dreams and waking experiences merged into a continuum in which consciousness was in constant flux. Family members recounted being unable to distinguish dream from reality, waking to find themselves in a room they had not entered, feeling an invisible weight pressing upon them, or hearing voices that recited their private thoughts aloud. These episodes were accompanied by physical sensations, chill, pressure, tingling, that reinforced the sense of an external force acting upon them. Attempts to find rest were futile, fatigue compounded anxiety, which in turn magnified susceptibility to the estate's influence. The household existed in a suspended state, neither fully awake nor truly asleep, trapped in a cycle of psychological strain that left no respite. Interpersonal dynamics deteriorated rapidly under the strain. Trust eroded as paranoia intensified, arguments escalated from minor misunderstandings to hours of tense silence, each family member interpreting the other's behaviors through a lens of fear. Children mirrored adult anxiety, sometimes withdrawing entirely, other times exhibiting bursts of agitation or hysteria. Attempts at reassurance or intervention often backfired, as the room's persistent influence amplified emotional responses. The estate, once a home, had become a crucible, testing the limits of familial bonds and psychological resilience. Emotional intimacy gave way to guarded interaction, and each member developed coping mechanisms tailored to survive the relentless pressure of their environment. Attempts at rational intervention were met with frustration and despair. Scientific observations, meticulous documentation, and environmental adjustments yielded little insight or relief. Objects continued to shift inexplicably, doors resisted or yielded unpredictably, light, shadow, and sound behaved in ways that defied logical explanation. Even when anomalies seemed temporarily subdued, they returned with renewed intensity, often in new forms. The family's strategies for maintaining control, recording events, establishing routines, or attempting to block access to certain areas, proved only partially effective, reinforcing a sense of helplessness and inevitability. Psychological strain manifested in increasingly pronounced ways. Anxiety, paranoia, and acute stress became omnipresent, coloring perception and response. Hallways and rooms seemed to elongate, compress, or reconfigure in subtle, disorienting ways. Shadows and reflections warped, creating fleeting illusions that triggered panic and confusion. Family members struggled to discern reality from hallucination, their cognition compromised by persistent fear and sleep deprivation. The room, and the estate as a whole, appeared to exploit these vulnerabilities, reinforcing its dominion over both mind and environment. Documentation intensified as a coping mechanism. Journals, diaries, and observational notes became essential for maintaining some semblance of understanding. Patterns were sought, sequences recorded, and anomalies logged with precision, yet each entry underscored the futility of comprehending the full scope of the room's influence. The act of recording provided temporary focus, but also reinforced the omnipresence of the estate's control. Even while attempting to assert agency, the family remained subject to forces they could not predict, measure, or contain. By this stage, the house had ceased to function merely as a physical structure and had become an active participant in the family's psychological decay. Its corridors, walls, and rooms operated according to principles entirely outside human comprehension, shaping perception, influencing thought, and dictating behavior. Ordinary objects and interactions were suffused with tension, every creak of wood, flicker of shadow, and shift of air carrying the weight of potential significance. The estate was both environment and agent, an inescapable force that dictated the rhythms of life and the contours of fear within its walls. The culmination of these disturbances marked the beginning of a deeper unraveling. Adults were consumed with maintaining order and understanding, children increasingly retreated into isolation or hypervigilance, and the once familiar estate transformed into a maze of unpredictable phenomena. Patterns emerged in anomalies, yet they offered no predictability, only the awareness that the room's influence was persistent, intentional, and beyond control. The family had entered a stage where survival demanded constant awareness, and any lapse, however brief, might invite further intrusion of the room's enigmatic power. The slow, relentless escalation of disturbances left the household teetering on the edge of psychological collapse, setting the stage for eventual isolation, despair, and confrontation with the full scope of the estate's unknowable forces. The passage of time did little to ease the family's torment. Instead, the estate's influence seemed to grow more calculated, more persistent, and more invasive. Ordinary life became almost impossible to sustain as the boundaries between external reality and the room's subtle manipulations blurred entirely. Shadows lengthened and shifted with deliberate timing, footsteps echoed in patterns that seemed designed to disorient, and objects moved with an intelligence that mocked human expectation. Attempts to maintain normalcy, preparing meals, tending to daily routines, or attempting familial interaction, were continuously undermined by the room's unpredictable yet purposeful interference. The family, once confident in their ability to manage disruptions, now navigated every action with a fragile vigilance, aware that any lapse could intensify the next disturbance. Isolation compounded these struggles. The village, already cautious of the family's reputation, avoided the estate almost entirely. Neighbors' curiosity gave way to fear, and visits from clergy or scholars became increasingly rare as even outsiders were overwhelmed by the estate's anomalous influence. This retreat of external observation left the family without validation or relief, reinforcing the perception that the room's power was absolute within its walls. Daily existence was confined to a narrow set of predictable behaviors, a regimented effort to minimize triggers while remaining constantly alert to the room's subtle manipulations. The psychological strain of such isolation created a feedback loop of fear, hypervigilance, and sleep deprivation that further heightened sensitivity to every anomaly. Children, already deeply affected by earlier disturbances, now exhibited behaviors that reflected both acute fear and adaptive strategies for survival. Some withdrew entirely into silence, avoiding interaction and minimizing exposure to the room's influence. Others became hyper-aware, tracking movements, listening for sounds, and monitoring the positions of objects in an almost obsessive manner. These behaviors, while functional in coping with immediate anxiety, further reinforced the household's atmosphere of tension, as adults interpreted them as both symptom and consequence of the room's persistent control. Each member of the family existed in a heightened state of vigilance, their every action and thought shadowed by the anticipation of disturbance. Attempts at intervention, rational, spiritual, or psychological, continued to yield inconsistent results. Scientific examination produced meticulous records of anomalies, yet failed to provide explanations sufficient to predict or control events. Religious and ritualistic measures offered moments of temporary calm, but these were invariably fleeting, leaving a deeper awareness of helplessness in their wake. The estate's behavior suggested a pattern and intent that transcended human comprehension, combining environmental manipulation, psychological influence, and possibly something else entirely beyond the reach of reason or faith. The duality of predictability and randomness created a persistent tension, keeping the family in a perpetual state of apprehension and anticipation. The psychological toll became increasingly evident. Anxiety, paranoia, and exhaustion dominated daily experience, eroding the capacity for reason and resilience. Family members struggled to distinguish between internal perception and external anomaly, leading to an ongoing internal debate over sanity, reality, and influence. Hallways, doors, and furniture seemed to operate under imperceptible rules, altering perception and interaction in ways that heightened the sense of disorientation. Sleep deprivation intensified these effects, as dreams intruded into waking consciousness, and waking experience bled into night terrors. The estate had become not merely a setting, but a psychological agent, shaping thought, emotion, and behavior with relentless consistency. Documentation continued to play a central role in coping, as the family meticulously recorded every anomaly, timing, and observed pattern. These records revealed repetitions, correlations, and sequences that hinted at an underlying intelligence guiding the disturbances. Yet the very act of documentation also reinforced the omnipresence of the estate's influence, as each entry confirmed the persistence and pervasiveness of the room's manipulations. The family's efforts to impose structure and understanding were met with simultaneous reassurance and despair, a constant reminder of both their agency and their vulnerability. Social interaction within the household itself became fraught. Adults oscillated between attempts at calm authority and episodes of panic or frustration, while children mirrored these emotional fluctuations in behaviors that ranged from withdrawal to sudden agitation. Communication became highly cautious, as even ordinary conversation risked triggering tension or misinterpretation. The family's cohesion, already strained by the room's persistent influence, began to erode further, leaving individuals increasingly dependent on internal coping mechanisms rather than mutual reassurance. Emotional intimacy was supplanted by vigilance and observation, each member monitoring the others as much as their surroundings for potential threat. External perspectives offered little relief. Scholars and observers could record and describe anomalies, but their interpretations were insufficient to alter the estate's influence. The duality of rational and folkloric explanations persisted, creating further tension as family members grappled with the limits of human understanding. Attempts at structural intervention, sealing rooms, rearranging furniture, or modifying the environment, proved ineffective, reinforcing the perception that the estate itself operated under its own rules. Each failed effort strengthened the room's presence, embedding a sense of inevitability and predestination into daily life. By this stage, the estate's influence was all-encompassing. Routine, sleep, social interaction, and perception were continuously disrupted, leaving the family in a state of perpetual tension. The room's manipulations had become systematic and precise, yet unpredictable, creating an environment in which survival demanded constant awareness, adaptation, and vigilance. Ordinary spaces became arenas of psychological challenge, and the family's existence was defined by a continuous negotiation with forces beyond understanding. The room, and the estate as a whole, had moved beyond anomaly into domination, asserting a presence that reshaped reality itself, leaving the family teetering on the edge of exhaustion, paranoia, and psychological collapse. The family's isolation reached its zenith as the estate's influence tightened its grip, creating a suffocating environment from which escape seemed impossible. Daily life became a precarious negotiation with forces that defied explanation, and the very fabric of perception and reality appeared to be under siege. Ordinary spaces, hallways, bedrooms, kitchens, were transformed into shifting arenas where shadows lengthened unnaturally, furniture moved subtly yet deliberately, and ambient sounds echoed with disquieting precision. No corner of the estate remained neutral, each area exerted its own pressure, compelling the family to constantly adapt, anticipate, and navigate the unpredictable logic of the room at the center of their torment. Sleep offered no refuge. Night after night, dreams intruded with vivid intensity, often continuing seamlessly into wakefulness. Family members described waking in rooms different from where they had fallen asleep, hearing voices reciting private thoughts aloud, or feeling physical sensations that persisted beyond the dream state. The disruption of restorative rest compounded fatigue, anxiety, and perceptual distortion, leaving each individual in a near-constant state of heightened alertness. Even the act of closing one's eyes carried risk, as the boundary between conscious and unconscious experience had been irrevocably compromised. Dreams and reality intertwined, creating a temporal disorientation in which the room's influence seemed continuous and omnipresent. The psychological toll was immense. Adults wrestled with their inability to protect or stabilize the household, oscillating between frustration, despair, and brief attempts at rationalization. Children exhibited increasingly extreme behaviors, some became withdrawn to the point of muteness, while others displayed hypervigilant monitoring of rooms and objects, as if anticipating the room's next maneuver. Emotional contagion spread within the household, as fear and hyperawareness reinforced itself across generations. Each member's mental and emotional state was inseparable from the others, creating a feedback loop in which anxiety, tension, and dread amplified the room's perceived presence and effect. The estate itself seemed to respond to the family's state. Shadows appeared more pronounced when fear was present, objects shifted when attention was directed elsewhere, and corridors subtly warped as if mirroring emotional turmoil. Even light and sound behaved inconsistently, heightening disorientation and suspicion. Ordinary interactions, walking through a hallway, picking up a dish, opening a window, became fraught with uncertainty. The family's home had ceased to function as a passive environment, it was now an active participant, shaping perception, emotion, and behavior with a precision that undermined autonomy. Attempts to regain control were increasingly desperate. Rituals, prayers, and blessings offered only temporary relief, while structural or environmental adjustments yielded little measurable impact. Documentation remained a critical tool, yet even meticulous journals could not fully capture or predict the estate's influence. Patterns were noted and sequences catalogued, but anomalies continued to manifest in ways that defied expectation. The duality of seeming predictability and unrelenting unpredictability created a persistent tension, reinforcing the sense that the family was enmeshed in forces beyond comprehension or control. Interpersonal dynamics became deeply strained. Trust and communication eroded as paranoia intensified. Arguments escalated rapidly, often triggered by minor misunderstandings, with the room amplifying emotional responses. Children mirrored these conflicts, either withdrawing entirely or acting out with sudden, unpredictable behaviors. Attempts at consolation or reassurance were frequently counterproductive, as the room's persistent influence seemed to manipulate perception and exacerbate tension. Emotional intimacy gave way to constant vigilance, and the household functioned less as a family unit than as a collective of individuals navigating an omnipresent, unseen force. The social environment outside the estate provided little respite. Neighbors and villagers avoided contact, reinforcing isolation. Scholars, religious figures, and medical professionals, once consulted, now approached with trepidation or abstained entirely, having been confounded or unnerved by prior encounters. The retreat of external support underscored the family's vulnerability, leaving them to confront the estate's influence with no validation or reprieve. The perception that the room's power was absolute became increasingly ingrained, further solidifying a sense of entrapment and inescapability. The estate's anomalies continued to manifest with increasing sophistication. Objects moved in patterns suggestive of intent, shadows coalesced into fleeting forms, and sounds aligned with moments of heightened emotional response. Time and space seemed to operate under altered rules, rooms felt larger or smaller depending on perception, corridors appeared to shift subtly, and moments of time distortion created the impression that hours passed in seconds or vice versa. The family's lived reality was redefined by these persistent manipulations, creating an environment in which ordinary logic, spatial understanding, and temporal awareness were unreliable guides. Coping mechanisms, while partially effective, proved insufficient. Routine, observation, and documentation provided structure but could not fully mitigate anxiety or restore a sense of control. Emotional strategies, calm reassurance, withdrawal, or hypervigilance, offered temporary relief yet were consistently undermined by the estate's unpredictable influence. The cumulative effect was a household caught in a continuous cycle of adaptation, reaction, and emotional strain, where each day reinforced the inescapable dominance of the room at the center of their lives. By the conclusion of this period, the family had reached a critical juncture. Exhaustion, paranoia, and hypervigilance dominated their experience, and the estate's anomalies had become all-encompassing, shaping thought, perception, and behavior. The room's influence was no longer episodic, it had become continuous, precise, and intentional, leaving the household in a state of suspended tension. The culmination of isolation, psychological strain, and the relentless presence of the room set the stage for the eventual collapse, signaling that the family's confrontation with the estate would escalate into consequences far beyond anything previously experienced. The prolonged exposure to the estate's oppressive influence began to exact a profound toll on the family's mental, emotional, and even physical well-being. By this stage, every aspect of daily life had been reframed by the room's relentless manipulation, leaving the family in a state of near-constant hypervigilance. Even ordinary actions, preparing meals, walking through hallways, or tending to personal hygiene, became fraught with tension, as each step was shadowed by the anticipation of disturbances. The room's influence was no longer limited to fleeting anomalies, it had become a continuous presence, an omnipresent force that dictated rhythm, behavior, and thought. Shadows elongated and shifted with uncanny precision, sounds resonated with eerie familiarity, and objects moved in patterns that suggested deliberation and intent. The estate had transformed from a home into a psychological labyrinth, an environment in which every perception was questioned and every action measured against potential consequence. Sleep deprivation reached its most debilitating phase. Nights offered neither rest nor reprieve, instead, the boundary between wakefulness and dreaming became increasingly porous. Family members reported waking in unfamiliar rooms, hearing whispered conversations that seemed to echo their innermost thoughts, or feeling invisible pressures constricting movement. Even the simplest gestures, reaching for a blanket, opening a door, or sitting in a chair, became acts laden with uncertainty and fear. Dreams bled seamlessly into waking life, producing episodes of temporal dislocation in which minutes could stretch into hours or entire sequences of experience replayed with subtle variation. The family existed in a liminal state, trapped between conscious perception and the intrusive logic of the room, their grasp on reality continually challenged and undermined. The psychological effects were cumulative and intergenerational. Adults, once confident in their ability to rationalize or control disturbances, now found themselves doubting every perception and decision. Anxiety, paranoia, and acute stress dominated thought processes, eroding patience, judgment, and resilience. Children, highly sensitive to both environmental stimuli and familial tension, exhibited pronounced behavioral shifts, some became withdrawn and unresponsive, while others displayed heightened alertness or obsessive monitoring of objects and spaces. Emotional contagion intensified the household's collective distress, as fear and hyper-awareness reverberated across family members, amplifying the impact of the room's manipulations. The estate's influence, far from being isolated, had become a shared psychological force that shaped cognition, emotion, and behavior simultaneously. Interactions among family members were fraught with tension and mistrust. Ordinary disagreements escalated into prolonged conflicts, fueled by heightened sensitivity and the room's subtle manipulations. Conversations were often shadowed by the anticipation of misinterpretation, and emotional responses were amplified beyond proportionality. Attempts at reassurance or consolation were frequently undermined by unexpected anomalies, reinforcing a sense of futility and helplessness. The family's cohesion, already strained by prolonged exposure to the estate's influence, began to fracture further, creating internal divisions and fostering a climate of perpetual vigilance. Emotional intimacy and spontaneous interaction became rare, replaced by careful observation and strategic silence. Attempts to seek external understanding or intervention offered diminishing returns. Scholars, clergy, and medical practitioners, once consulted, had retreated in the face of repeated failures, leaving the family with few sources of validation or relief. Documentation remained a central coping strategy, with meticulous records of disturbances, patterns, and personal responses maintained in journals. Yet even this methodical approach highlighted the futility of comprehension. While sequences and anomalies could be catalogued, they could not be predicted or controlled. The estate's behavior remained both patterned and unpredictable, fostering a constant tension between apparent order and overwhelming uncertainty. Environmental observations intensified in their detail and precision. The family noted subtle distortions in space. Hallways seemed to contract or elongate, rooms appeared to shift imperceptibly, and light behaved inconsistently, producing shadows and reflections that defied logic. Objects continued to move in ways that suggested intentionality, while ambient sounds, footsteps, murmurs, and unexplained creaks, occurred in discernible sequences that often corresponded to moments of heightened emotional vulnerability. The room operated as an autonomous force within the estate, continuously interacting with the family in ways that both challenged comprehension and amplified psychological strain. The cumulative effect on perception was profound. Family members struggled to differentiate between reality and illusion, as the room's manipulations created overlapping layers of sensory and cognitive disturbance. Visual, auditory, and tactile experiences were continually influenced, producing moments of disorientation, fear, and heightened anticipation. Even familiar environments became unpredictable, and habitual routines were constantly threatened by subtle but deliberate anomalies. This persistent distortion undermined confidence, reasoning, and the ability to respond to events with clarity, further entrenching the family's sense of entrapment. Behavioral adaptations became necessary for survival, though they provided only partial relief. Adults employed constant vigilance, tracking the movement of objects and the timing of sounds in an effort to anticipate disturbances. Children developed hyper-awareness and avoidance strategies, retreating into corners or silent observation to minimize interaction with the room's influence. Daily life was dominated by monitoring, recording, and adapting to anomalies, leaving little space for spontaneity or emotional recovery. The household functioned less as a conventional family unit than as a carefully managed system of observation and response, each member attuned to the estate's subtle cues and each interaction shaped by the omnipresent influence of the room. The estate's cumulative psychological impact culminated in a pervasive sense of inevitability and helplessness. The family's awareness of the room's patterns, while offering some insight, also reinforced the perception that control was impossible. Every effort at intervention, spiritual, rational, or structural, was met with partial or temporary success at best, and often exacerbated the sense of powerlessness. The room's influence extended beyond observable phenomena to shape thought, expectation, and emotion, creating an environment in which survival required constant adaptation and vigilance, yet offered no certainty of relief or safety. By the end of this period, the household existed in a state of continuous tension, where every perception, decision, and interaction was mediated by the estate's pervasive influence. The line between reality and manipulation had been irrevocably blurred, and the family's psychological, emotional, and social structures were stretched to their limits. The room had become an omnipresent agent, dictating the rhythms of daily life, eroding autonomy, and reshaping consciousness itself. The stage was set for the eventual collapse, isolation, and confrontation with forces beyond understanding, leaving the family's fate entwined with the estate in ways that would endure long after external observers had departed.